It started with a storm, and not the metaphorical kind. Rain lashed against my window, thunder growling in the distance as my laptop screen froze mid-call. "No, no, no," I groaned, staring at the dreaded disconnected icon. The deadline loomed like an axe over my head, and without the Wi-Fi, I was utterly doomed. I glanced at my router, blinking its little red light of betrayal, and let out a defeated sigh. My options were limited. That's when I remembered him. Across the hall lived Cashton. Cash, as he introduced himself in passing once. He was the tall, quiet type, with a confidence that radiated effortlessly. I'd only ever seen him coming or going, usually in jeans and a hoodie, carrying his laptop bag like some tech-savvy superhero. Desperation overpowered my reluctance. Wrapping myself in a sweater, I crossed the hallway, heart pounding for reasons I couldn't fully justify. When I knocked, the door swung open, and there he was, casually leaning against the frame. "What's up, neighbor?" he asked, his lips curving into a grin. "My Wi-Fi is out, and I'm kind of in a bind," I stammered. "Could you help?" His grin deepened, and for a second, I wondered if he found my helplessness amusing. "Sure thing. Let me grab my gear." As he stepped into my apartment moments later, I felt oddly self-conscious. It wasn't like I lived in a mess, but the sight of him scanning my space made me, suddenly, aware of every imperfect detail. Books piled on the table, a half-empty coffee cup on my desk. "I'll take a look," he said, crouching by the router. "Now, I've got to pause for a second here. If you're already curious about where this is heading, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more unexpected twists like this. You won't believe how things escalated after this moment. Trust me." "So, you're a designer, huh?" Cash's voice pulled me out of my thoughts. I blinked, following his gaze to my sketches spread across the desk. "Yeah, freelance. Deadlines are my life." "Figures. Deadlines don't wait for bad Wi-Fi," he teased, his hands deftly untangling the mess of cables. "Tell me about it." I watched him work, impressed by his efficiency. "What about you? I mean, I know you're in IT or something." "Yeah, tech support. Nothing fancy," he replied. "But hey, it pays the bills and gets me free coffee at work." His casual humor put me at ease. For someone who seemed reserved at first glance, Cash had a way of making the air around him lighter. "Looks like a simple reset issue," he said, straightening up. "But I'll make sure everything's secure while I'm at it." And just like that, my simple cry for help turned into something far more intriguing. Little did I know, this moment was only the beginning of a night I'd never forget. Cash crouched by the router, his focus sharp as he fiddled with the cables and reset the device. I stood nearby, unsure if I should hover or pretend to be busy. Instead, I found myself watching him work. He wasn't in a rush. Every move he made seemed deliberate, like he'd done this 1,000 times, but still took it seriously. His hands moved with ease, confident but not hurried, and the faint furrow in his brow hinted at concentration. "You've got a decent setup here," he said, glancing back at me with a small smile. "Oh, thanks. I just kind of winged it when I moved in," I replied, leaning against the desk. As he returned to his work, I let my eyes wander again. He had a casual kind of charm, his hoodie slightly wrinkled, his hair a little messy, but in a way that looked effortlessly cool. And then there were his eyes, a soft shade of brown, warm and inviting. I realized I'd never noticed them before, and for some reason, that stuck with me. "So, what kind of freelance work do you do exactly?" he asked, breaking the silence. "Mostly graphic design, branding, websites, logos. It's a mix of fun and stressful," I said. He chuckled. "Sounds like my job. People call you in a panic, expecting you to perform miracles." I laughed, nodding. "Pretty much." You'd think people would understand deadlines better, but nope. Our conversation flowed so naturally, it surprised me. He talked about his love for photography, which I never would have guessed. I told him about my recent obsession with street art in the city, and before I knew it, we were comparing favourite spots to explore. As I reached to hand him the screwdriver from the table, our hands brushed. It was the lightest touch, but it lingered in the air between us like an unsaid thought. I quickly pulled back, my heart skipping a beat. "Here, you go," I said, a little too quickly. "Thanks," he said softly, his voice calm but his expression unreadable. The room felt warmer somehow, and I wasn't sure if it was the storm outside or the weight of something unspoken growing between us. "So, how'd you end up in Chicago?" I asked, shifting the focus back to him. "Long story, but I like it here. The people, the energy, it's got its own vibe," he said, glancing at me as if I were part of what made the city special. I felt a flutter in my chest, but brushed it off, determined not to read too much into his words. Still, there was no denying the magnetic pull in the air between us. And just like that, what should have been a routine Wi-Fi fix was turning into something far more interesting. The steady rhythm of rain against the windows had become background noise as Cash worked on the router. Occasionally, he muttered under his breath, his voice low and thoughtful, as though troubleshooting out loud. "Okay, here's the deal," he said, straightening up. "Your hardware's fine, but there's a configuration issue. I'll need to reset a few things and tweak the settings. Got any tools around?" I blinked, caught off guard. Tools? I think there's a small kit under the sink. Hold on." As I rummaged through the cabinet in the kitchen, I could hear him humming softly. When I returned with the box, he grinned. "Nice. You're better prepared than most people I help." "I wouldn't go that far," I joked. "I think I used this to fix a chair leg once, and that's about it." Cash chuckled, shaking his head as he opened the box and examined the contents. "Hey, you never know when you'll need to play handyman." He pulled out a small screwdriver and returned to his task, crouching by the router. Again, I found myself smiling, watching his easy movements and listening to his occasional comments about how outdated my setup was. "You know," I said, leaning against the counter, "for someone who's only ever waved hello in passing, you're surprisingly talkative." He glanced over his shoulder, an amused look on his face. "What can I say? You bring out the chatterbox in me." His tone was casual, but there was a spark in his expression that caught me off guard. I laughed, trying to shake off the warmth creeping into my cheeks. "Anyway, don't judge my setup too harshly," I said, crossing my arms. "It gets the job done. Well, most of the time." "Until it doesn't," he teased, flashing me a grin before focusing back on the wires. The conversation drifted into light, playful territory, and before I knew it, we were teasing each other about our tech skills, or, in my case, lack thereof. He had a way of making even mundane moments feel effortless, like it was easy to let my guard down around him. Then the lights flickered. It was brief, but enough to make me glance toward the window. The storm had grown louder, with thunder rumbling like a distant drumbeat. "Whoa," I muttered. "That's a little ominous." Cash stood, his silhouette momentarily outlined by the dim light. "Don't worry, these old buildings can handle it. Most of the time." "Not exactly reassuring," I said, raising an eyebrow. He laughed, and the sound filled the room, lightening the moment. But when the lights flickered again, it left us standing much closer than I'd realized. His presence, suddenly more noticeable in the muted glow. There was a quiet pause, the kind that made the air feel heavier. I glanced up at him, catching the faintest hint of something in his expression. Curiosity, maybe, or something deeper. "You've got a cozy place here," he said, his voice breaking the silence. I tilted my head, surprised. "Cozy? That's a nice way of saying small." "No, I mean it," he replied, leaning slightly against the desk. "It feels lived in. Personal." There was a softness to his tone that made me forget the storm outside for a moment. I looked around the room, seeing it through his eyes, the little details I'd never thought much about. The framed art on the walls, the stack of books by the window, the plants in mismatched pots. "Well, thanks," I said, feeling oddly self-conscious. He smiled, and the charged atmosphere seemed to hum louder. I didn't know what to say next, and maybe I didn't need to. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was something else entirely. "Almost done," he said after a beat, turning back to the router. The moment passed, but the warmth lingered. I busied myself tidying up nearby, trying to keep my mind from over-analyzing the way his voice softened when he talked about my space or how the dim light made his features seem sharper. As he worked, we fell into a rhythm of easy conversation again. He told me about his favorite coffee shop a few blocks away, and I mentioned a park I loved to visit when I needed a creative boost. We swapped stories about city life, laughing over shared annoyances like parking and noisy neighbours. The storm outside raged on, but inside, everything felt calm. Almost too calm. And as I stood there, watching him finish up, I couldn't shake the sense that this wasn't just a typical neighbourly favour. Something was building, slow and steady, like the quiet rumble before the next crash of thunder. Cash tightened the last cable on the router and stood up, brushing his hands together like he'd just completed a monumental task. "And you should be back online," he said, his voice calm but carrying a hint of triumph. I didn't move immediately. Instead, I stood near the desk, watching him as he glanced at the glowing router lights, seemingly unaware of the electricity humming in the room between us. "Thanks," I said softly, my voice barely above a whisper. When he turned, he noticed I was closer than before, so close that I could see the faint freckles on his nose and the slight curve of his lips as they parted to say something. But no words came. Instead, his gaze locked on mine, and the air between us seemed to thrum with unspoken energy. For a moment, time stopped. The storm outside roared with a fury, the rain lashing against the windows, but all I could hear was the wild rhythm of my heartbeat. His eyes searched mine, as though silently asking a question neither of us dared to voice. I wasn't sure who moved first. Maybe it was him, or maybe it was me. But in the next breath, we were leaning toward each other, drawn together as if by gravity. The kiss started, soft, tentative. An unspoken exploration. His lips were warm, his touch feather-light as his hand brushed against my cheek. I felt my breath hitch, my mind spinning, but any hesitation dissolved the moment his fingers tangled in my hair, pulling me closer. It wasn't tentative for long. The kiss deepened, his touch growing bolder, and I matched his intensity without a second thought. My hands moved to his shoulders, feeling the tension in his muscles as he held me like I was something he didn't want to let go of. The rain outside pounded harder, a chaotic backdrop to the storm building between us. His hands slid to my waist, pulling me against him, and the heat of his body sent a shiver down my spine. The space around us seemed to shrink until nothing else existed, just the two of us, lost in the moment. "Savannah," he murmured against my lips, his voice low and rough, sending a thrill through me. I didn't respond with words. Instead, I pressed closer, letting the urgency between us speak for itself. The storm outside mirrored the storm inside me, wild, untamed, and impossible to ignore. Somehow, We stumbled back toward the couch. I didn't even remember moving, but the next thing I knew, we were sinking into the cushions, his hands tracing paths along my sides that sent sparks skittering across my skin. Every touch, every kiss, felt electric, like nothing else I'd ever experienced. There was no hesitation, no second guessing, just raw, unfiltered emotion that left me breathless. Cash's touch was both firm and gentle, like he understood exactly how to hold me without breaking the spell. His lips trailed down my neck, leaving a trail of fire in their wake, and I found myself gripping his hoodie as if it were the only thing tethering me to reality. The storm outside howled, the wind rattling the windows, but it only added to the intensity of the moment. Each crack of thunder seemed to echo the pounding of my heart, each flash of lightning illuminating the room in brief, brilliant bursts. I didn't care about the Wi-Fi anymore, or the deadlines I'd been stressing over. In that moment, nothing else mattered except the way he looked at me, the way he touched me, like I was the only thing in the world he wanted. When his hands cupped my face, tilting my head back to meet his gaze, I saw something in his eyes that took my breath away. It wasn't just desire, it was something deeper, something that made my chest tighten and my stomach flip. Neither of us spoke. We didn't need to. Everything we felt, everything we wanted, was laid bare in that moment. And as the storm outside reached its peak, so did we, losing ourselves entirely to the heat of the moment. It was messy and intense, driven by a passion neither of us could deny. Every touch, every kiss felt like a spark igniting a flame that refused to be extinguished. By the time we finally pulled apart, breathless and flushed, the room felt different. The air was still charged, but softer now, like the eye of the storm had finally settled over us. Cash rested his forehead against mine, his breath warm against my skin. Neither of us said a word, and for once, the silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was perfect. The storm outside continued to rage, but inside, everything felt calm. The soft morning light streamed through the blinds, casting golden stripes across the room. For a moment, I stayed still, the events of the previous night replaying in my mind like fragments of a dream. The storm outside had long since passed, leaving the world quiet and still. I stretched, feeling the warmth of the blanket draped over me, and realized the subtle smell of coffee was drifting through the air. My heart skipped a beat. He was still here. Slipping out of bed, I padded toward the kitchen. There he was, Cash, leaning casually against the counter, a mug in one hand and his phone in the other. He looked up as I entered, his face breaking into an easy smile that made my stomach do a little flip. "Good morning," he said, his voice warm and steady. "Hope you don't mind. I found the coffee stash." I laughed softly, shaking my head. "Not at all. I didn't peg you as a morning person, though." "Ah, well," he said, setting his phone aside. "Staying over and then sneaking out without making coffee would have been bad form." The playful tone in his voice eased the lingering tension I hadn't even realized I was holding. He poured me a mug, sliding it across the counter. "Thanks," I said, taking a sip. The warmth of the coffee seemed to spread through me, chasing away any remaining awkwardness. For a while, we didn't say much. The quiet was comfortable, almost companionable. And I found myself studying him again, noticing the way his hair was slightly tousled and the relaxed way he leaned against the counter. He felt different here in the morning light, less like a neighbor and more like someone I wanted to know. "So," he began, breaking the silence. "What's a freelance graphic designer's morning routine? Coffee first, or do you dive straight into work?" I grinned. "Coffee first, always, especially if the Wi-Fi is behaving. He chuckled at that, shaking his head. Well, good to know I've cemented my reputation as the guy who saves the day. But honestly, I should have been more prepared last night. I didn't think troubleshooting would take that long. It wasn't just the Wi-Fi that kept you here, I said, before I could stop myself. My words hung in the air for a moment, and I felt my cheeks heat up. He didn't seem fazed, though. If anything, his expression softened and he set his coffee down, folding his arms across his chest. No, it wasn't, he said simply. A small smile tugged at my lips, and I looked away, suddenly aware of how fast my heart was beating. So, is this something you do often? I teased, trying to lighten the mood. Fix Wi-Fi? All the time, he quipped. Then, after a beat, he added more seriously, but no, this isn't something I do often. The way he said it made my chest tighten in a way I wasn't expecting. We settled onto the couch, each with our coffee in hand, and the conversation turned more personal. I don't know what it was, maybe the lingering intimacy from the night before, but I found myself opening up to him in a way I hadn't with anyone in a long time. I told him about how freelancing could be lonely, about the struggle to balance independence with the longing for connection. He listened, his attention focused entirely on me. And when he spoke, his words carried a weight that felt grounding. I get that, he said, nodding. After my engagement ended, I spent a lot of time convincing myself that I was better off alone. Less risk that way. But the truth is it gets exhausting, you know? Trying to act like you're fine all the time. I glanced at him, surprised by his honesty. You were engaged? He nodded, his gaze distant for a moment. A couple of years ago. It didn't work out. She wanted something different. Someone different, I guess. It left me questioning a lot, especially about whether I'm built for that kind of commitment. His candor caught me off guard, but it also made me feel less alone in my own doubts. I guess we're both trying to figure things out, I said softly. Yeah, he said, his eyes meeting mine. But maybe that's not such a bad thing. The weight of his words lingered, and for a moment I felt an odd sense of relief. Here was someone who understood, someone who wasn't afraid to admit that life didn't always go as planned. We sat there for a while longer, the conversation weaving through lighter topics like favourite movies and embarrassing childhood stories. By the time the coffee mugs were empty, the sun was shining brightly through the windows, and the city outside had come to life again. As Cash stood to rinse out his mug, I couldn't help but wonder what this connection meant, where it might lead. But for now, I was content to let things unfold at their own pace. Well, he said, turning to me with a smile that felt genuine and warm. I should probably let you get to work. Thanks for the coffee, and the company. Thanks for fixing the Wi-Fi, I replied, my voice light but my heart heavier than I expected. As he headed for the door, he glanced back, his hand lingering on the doorknob. See you around, Savannah. Yeah, I said, nodding. See you around. The door closed behind him, and the apartment felt quieter than it had before. But instead of the usual sense of isolation, there was something else, something that felt like possibility. The week had passed in a blur of deadlines and virtual meetings, but I couldn't shake the thought of Cash. His easy smile, the way he listened so intently, it lingered in my mind like a pleasant echo. Then, on a cloudy Thursday evening, a knock at my door broke my concentration. I wasn't expecting anyone, but when I opened it, there he was, Cash, holding a small toolkit and wearing that familiar, lopsided grin. Hey, he said, leaning casually against the doorframe. Just wanted to check in and make sure your Wi-Fi hasn't staged another rebellion. I laughed and stepped aside to let him in. It's been behaving so far, thanks to your magic touch. Good to hear, he said, setting his tools on the counter. Mind if I take a quick look anyway, just to be sure? Go for it, I said, gesturing toward the router. As he crouched near the cables, I couldn't help but notice how focused he looked, his brows furrowed in concentration. He worked with such ease, as if solving problems was second nature to him. But then he paused, his hand hovering over the tangle of cords. That's strange, he muttered. What is it? I asked, stepping closer. He pulled out a small, unfamiliar device that had been tucked away near the router. It was no bigger than a deck of cards, with wires attached to it. This isn't part of your setup, he said, turning it over in his hands. I frowned, confusion mingling with unease. What is it? A booster or something? Not exactly, he said, his tone cautious. It looks more like a transmitter. These are usually used for surveillance or data monitoring. My stomach dropped. Wait, are you saying someone might be spying on me? It's possible, he said, his voice calm but serious. It's definitely not standard hardware. Have you noticed anything unusual lately? Like someone asking odd questions about your work or schedule? I shook my head, trying to think. No, nothing like that. But my landlord, he's always been a little too involved. He once let himself into my apartment, without notice, to check a leak that didn't exist. Cash's jaw tightened. That's not okay. And if this is his doing, he trailed off, his expression darkening. What should I do? I asked, the anxiety creeping into my voice. For starters, let me see if I can pull any data from this thing, he said, holding up the device. If it's been transmitting, there might be logs or recordings we can access. I nodded, grateful for his level-headedness. Okay, do whatever you need to. He set up his laptop on my kitchen counter, connecting the device with a tangle of cables. As he typed, his face was a mask of concentration. I hovered nearby, my nerves jangling like live wires. After a few minutes, he exhaled sharply. Got it, he said, tilting the screen so I could see. The files he'd retrieved were a mix of audio recordings and logs of network activity. My name appeared repeatedly, along with timestamps that lined up with my daily routine. My heart pounded as I realized just how invasive it all was. This is insane, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. It's more than that, Cash said, scrolling through the data. It's illegal. Whoever set this up has been monitoring you without your consent. I felt a wave of anger rising, eclipsing the initial shock. It has to be my landlord. No one else has access to my apartment. Could be, Cash agreed. But we'll need proof before taking this to the authorities. I can dig deeper, but it might take some time. I nodded, my hands clenched into fists. Do whatever you have to. I can't let this slide. He looked at me then, his expression softening. Hey, he said gently. We'll figure this out, okay? You're not dealing with this alone. The reassurance in his voice calmed me, and for the first time since he'd found the device, I felt a flicker of hope. For the next hour, we combed through the files together, piecing together a timeline of when the device had been active. Each discovery added to the growing sense of violation, but having Cash there made it bearable. As he packed up his laptop and the device, he turned to me with a determined look. I'll analyze this further tonight and let you know what I find. In the meantime, maybe think about changing your locks. I nodded, appreciating his practicality. Thank you, Cash. Really. I don't know what I'd do without you. He smiled, and for a moment, the tension in the room eased. You're tougher than you think, Savannah, but I'm glad I could help. As he left, the weight of what we'd uncovered settled over me. But alongside the fear and anger was a growing resolve. Whoever had invaded my privacy would face the consequences, and with Cash's help, I was determined to make that happen. The next morning, I woke up with a heavy sense of purpose. The evidence Cash had uncovered was damning, and the thought of confronting my landlord filled me with both dread and determination. I wasn't going to let this go. I texted Cash, and he replied almost immediately, "Ready when you are." That simple message gave me the courage I needed. We decided to meet in the lobby of my building, where Cash waited with his laptop bag slung over one shoulder. His calm presence grounded me as I approached. "Are you sure about this?" I asked, my voice barely steady. "Absolutely," he said with a nod. "You deserve answers, and he needs to be held accountable. Let's do this." The landlord, Mr. Greaves, was in his office, a cramped, cluttered room just off the lobby. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting an unflattering glow on his ruddy face. He looked up from his desk as we entered, his expression shifting from mild irritation to wariness. "What's this about?" he asked, his tone gruff. I took a deep breath, feeling Cash's reassuring presence beside me. "We need to talk about something we found in my apartment," I said, keeping my voice steady. Mr. Greaves leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest. "What are you talking about?" Cash wasted no time. He pulled out the small device we'd discovered and set it on the desk. "This," he said simply. The landlord's eyes flickered to the device, and for a moment his confident facade slipped. "I don't know what that is," he said quickly. "Probably something you installed yourself." Cash raised an eyebrow, his expression calm but unyielding. "Really?" "Because this something has been transmitting data directly to a server that's tied to your name. We've got the logs to prove it." Mr. Greaves's face reddened, and he sat up straighter, his bluster returning. "That's ridiculous! You're making wild accusations without evidence." "That's where you're wrong," Cash said, opening his laptop. He navigated to the files he'd retrieved and turned the screen toward Mr. Greaves. "This is a record of every transmission from that device. The IP address traces back to your office. Care to explain that?" I watched as Mr. Greaves's confidence wavered, his eyes darting between the screen and the device on his desk. He opened his mouth to argue, but seemed to think better of it. "Look," he said finally, his tone shifting to one of placation. "I didn't mean any harm. It was just a precaution. You know how tenants can be, causing damage, bringing in unauthorized guests." "Are you serious?" I interrupted, my anger boiling over. "You spied on me because you assumed I'd cause trouble? That's disgusting." "Not to mention illegal," Cash added, his tone sharp. "Do you have any idea what kind of trouble you're in? We could take this straight to the police." Mr. Greaves's face turned a shade paler. "Now, there's no need for that," he said quickly. "Let's not blow this out of proportion. I'm willing to make amends. Compensate you for the inconvenience." "Inconvenience?" I repeated, incredulous. "You invaded my privacy, recorded who knows what, and you think money will make this go away?" Cash placed a steadying hand on my shoulder, a silent reminder to stay calm. "Here's what's going to happen," he said firmly. "You're going to compensate Savannah for damages, real damages, not some token offer. And you're going to disable any other surveillance devices in this building immediately. If we so much as suspect that you've kept anything running, we'll report this to the authorities. Understood?" Mr. Greaves hesitated, clearly weighing his options. Finally, he gave a reluctant nod. "Fine. I'll pay damages and remove the devices. But this stays between us." "Good choice," Cash said, his tone icy. "But don't think for a second we won't follow up to make sure you've held up your end of the deal." I left the office with a mix of relief and lingering anger. Cash walked beside me, his hand briefly brushing against mine. "You handled that well," he said, offering a small smile. "I couldn't have done it without you," I admitted. "Thank you for everything, Cash. I mean it," he shrugged, his expression softening. "You don't have to thank me. You deserved better than what he pulled." As we rode the elevator back up to my apartment, I felt a sense of clarity. It was time to move on, not just from the apartment, but from the shadow of fear and violation Mr. Greaves had cast over my life. "I'm going to start looking for a new place," I said, breaking the silence. Cash glanced at me, a hint of hesitation in his eyes. "If you need help, I know a few good spots around the city. I can even recommend some landlords who aren't complete creeps." I laughed, the sound lighter than I'd expected. "I might take you up on that." When we reached my door, I turned to face him. "Seriously, Cash, you've gone above and beyond for me. I don't know how I'll ever repay you." "You don't have to," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "That's what friends—" He paused, a slight smile tugging at his lips. "Or neighbours are for." As I closed the door behind me, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Gratitude, relief, and a growing sense of something deeper that I wasn't quite ready to name. For now, I was focused on the next steps. Moving out of the apartment was just the beginning, but with Cash by my side, I knew I wouldn't face it alone. The moving truck pulled away from the curb, leaving me standing in front of my new apartment building. It wasn't anything fancy, a modest brick complex on a quieter street in Lincoln Park. But it already felt like a sanctuary. I turned to Cash, who stood beside me with his hands in his pockets, his usual easy smile on his face. "Well," he said, glancing at the building, "this is definitely a step up. No creepy landlords, no hidden cameras. I think you'll like it here." I smiled back, feeling a warmth I hadn't in a long time. "I think so too, and I couldn't have done this without you, Cash. Seriously." He shrugged, but I didn't miss the slight flush on his cheeks. "Hey, I just pointed you in the right direction. The rest was all you." We spent the next few hours unpacking the essentials, falling into an easy rhythm. Cash carried boxes, teased me about my growing collection of coffee mugs, and even managed to set up my Wi-Fi in record time. His specialty, of course. As we worked, I couldn't help but notice how much lighter I felt. It wasn't just the move. It was the sense of freedom that came with leaving behind the toxicity of my old place and the fresh energy that Cash seemed to bring into every corner of my life. By the time we finished, the sun was setting, casting a warm orange glow across the apartment. We stood in the small but cozy living room, surveying our progress. "Well," Cash said, wiping his hands on his jeans, "I'd say this place is officially move-in ready. What do you think?" "I think I owe you dinner," I said, grinning. He laughed. "Is that your way of saying you're starving?" "Maybe," I admitted. We ended up at a local diner down the street, the kind with mismatched chairs and a menu that hadn't changed in decades. Over burgers and milkshakes, we talked about everything. Work, favourite travel spots, even the ridiculous shows we secretly loved to binge-watch. It felt natural, easy, like we'd known each other forever. And yet, there was still an undercurrent of something new, something electric that neither of us felt the need to define just yet. When we walked back to my building, the city around us quiet and peaceful, I found myself hesitating at the door. "I guess this is good night," I said, turning to face him. Cash looked at me for a long moment, his expression soft. "For now," he said, his voice low. "But you know where to find me." I smiled, and without thinking, I reached up and hugged him. He held me close, his arms warm and steady, and for a moment, I let myself savour the feeling. When we finally pulled apart, he gave me one last grin. "Good night, Savannah." "Good night, Cash." I watched him walk away before heading upstairs to my new apartment. As I settled onto the couch, the hum of the city filtering through the window, I felt a quiet contentment settle over me. The last few weeks had been a whirlwind, full of unexpected challenges and revelations. But they'd also brought me something I hadn't realized I was missing. Connection, not just with someone else, but with myself. Cash had been a big part of that, of course. His presence had been like a steady hand guiding me through the chaos. But more than that, he'd reminded me of my own strength, the courage to stand up for myself, to leave behind what wasn't serving me, and to take a chance on something new. I didn't know what the future held for us, and for the first time, I was okay with that. Life didn't always have to be planned out. Sometimes it was enough to take things one day at a time. With that thought, I curled up on the couch, letting the peace of my new space wash over me. This wasn't just a new apartment. It was a fresh start, a chance to rewrite my story on my own terms. And as I drifted off to sleep, I couldn't help but feel excited about what the next chapter might bring. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey. If you enjoyed Savannah's story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more exciting tales like this one. Also, if you'd like to support the channel and help us keep creating great content, consider donating through Super Thanks or clicking the join button to become a member for exclusive perks. See you in the next story.